Hello, my name is Diana Esparza. I am an English instructor at the EPCC Rio Grande campus. And this is my student, well, she was my student, Mikaela Jensen. Mikaela, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So originally I am from Texas. I spent a little bit of time in El Paso and then a little bit in the Austin area, but all of my high school I was in Wyoming. So very tiny town, 7,000 people. Briefly I was in the army and then now I'm just pursuing accounting as my degree and I would like to eventually be a librarian, but that's a master's degree, so that's a couple years in the future.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I love that was brief and concise. All right, so this is long story short, a project of the 2024-2025 EPCC UTEP Humanities Collaborative. And today we're going to have a conversation about Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, The Telltale Heart, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, and if we have time, The Pit and the Pendulum. So I would like to get started by talking a little bit about the author. I'm pretty sure most people know who Edgar Allan Poe is. But just to get a little bit more into depth of as to who he was as a person, I guess I'm going to read a little bit of an overview of his life. Well, not too much, from the Poetry Foundation. I did have another overview that was perfect, but I forgot my book, so I'm just gonna read a little bit more, a little bit from what it's on the Poetry Foundation. And if you would like to check it out, it's the poetryfoundation.org. You can find, of course, a lot of his work, and you can find a little bit of the story of his life. I'm just going to read a little bit of a piece. So, Edgar Allan Poe's stature as a major figure in world literature is primarily based on his ingenious and profound short stories, poems, and critical theories, which established a highly influential rationale for the short form in both poetry and fiction. Regarded in literary histories and handbooks as the architect of the modern short story, Poe was also the principal forerunner of the art for art's sake movement in 19th century European literature. Whereas earlier critics predominantly concerned themselves with moral or ideological generalities, Poe focused his criticism on the specifics of style and construction that contributed to a work's effectiveness or failure. In his work, he demonstrated a brilliant command of language and technique, as well as an inspired and original imagination. Poe's poetry and short stories greatly influenced the French symbolists of the late 19th century, who in turn altered the direction of modern literature. So that's just a brief overview. Um, and so we can start with the Telltale Heart. So, Mikaela, what I would like to have you do is to just give us an overview of the story. What happens in the story? Um, Go ahead and tell us.
So Telltale Heart's pretty short, and it starts with a man asking you why you think he's insane. He's talking to you, the reader, and he's giving a retelling of a murder he's committed. And he says that he was very present, very wise, and meticulous about this crime he's committed, and he'll emphasize that throughout the whole story. He's like, would a crazy man do this? No. And he's talking about this old man who has an eye that I assume is blind. It feels like it's blind, and it's really creepy to him. He says it looks like a vulture's eye. It's like filmy, and it really disturbs him. And he killed this man. This old man is dead. He's the murder he's describing. And he says that he didn't kill him because he hated him or because he wanted his money. No, no, no. He killed him because that eye really freaked him out. And he describes how he does it. He says for like a whole week, he creeps into his room at night and he puts a little lantern and he carefully shines it on the eye. And every night, the eye is closed. And he can't kill the guy because he likes the guy. It's just the eye. And on the last night, stuff gets a little messy. He accidentally makes some noise and the old man wakes up. The old man sits up and he waits for hours and hours. And finally, he opens the lantern, he shines light, and the eye is open. But the old man's still awake and he can't kill him. So he waits and he waits and he waits. And finally, he kills the old man. He just yells, runs in, kills him, and then he hides the body in the floorboards. And a couple hours after he's cleaned up the whole crime scene, he's like, nobody will ever figure this out. I was meticulous, it's perfect. Some cops come over. They say, hey, somebody heard a scream, and what was up? And he goes, oh, I screamed in my sleep. The old man's out on a trip. There's no worries. And he invites them in, and they're sitting in the room where he's hidden the body. And they're chatting and everything's chill, but he's paranoid, and he's getting more and more paranoid. He swears he can hear the heart beating the floorboards, and it's so loud, he's like, how on earth are the cops not hearing this? They're playing with me, they're toying with me. And the story ends with him yelling at the cops saying, check under the floorboards, I killed him, he's there, like, stop messing with me. And that's the end. And the whole time he's saying, I'm not crazy, would a crazy man do this? And it's like, yes, this is definitely the stuff that a crazy man would do the whole time.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Was a great overview. Um, so what do you think about this story? What was something that maybe you liked, or maybe something that caught your attention, or maybe something that creeped you out, or anything like that? What are your feelings about the story?
This is my favorite Edgar Allan Poe story. I like how short it is, for one. It's one of the easiest ones to get into, I think. He doesn't use too many complicated words. The plot is pretty easy to understand, so it's not hard to get lost in. And my favorite is that it feels very sarcastic from the writer's perspective, because the whole time he's like, oh, smart, I'm wise, look at how wise. It's a very clear example of like an unreliable narrator, so it's kind of fun to read. But then also, I mentioned earlier before we started recording, there was this animation that I saw when I was very young of the Telltale Heart that like freaked me out really bad. And it, I think, showed the side that I wasn't getting when I was reading it, which is the really creepy part. Because in the animation, it's very uncanny, unnerving. The way they animated the eye for the old man is very animal-like, and it immerses you in it more. And that kind of tied into me the part I wasn't getting from the story, which is that it is really creepy, it is really unnerving to read about how this guy like kills someone that he's friends with for like no reason, It's like if somebody decided they hated the color of my hair and was like, I have to kill you for that. Like, it's really disturbing to think about. And that kind of has stuck with me. And it helps that it's such an easy story to get into as well, because I just like read this when I was little, so it's stuck with me since. I guess I could bring up my favorite passage
Yes,
from it to
definitely.
highlight this. Um, so page 187. At the very beginning, these are my favorite parts from it. It's like the third sentence. He says, why will you say that I am mad? And then, following paragraphs, he's describing the beginning of the murder. And he says, object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point you fancy me mad. Mad men know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, and with what dissimulation I went to work. I like that. I think it frames the whole story, and I also think it's very encapsulating of the vibes of it, because it's just like immediately he's like, yeah, there was no reason, but I did it really well. And that, I think, is kind of why this story is so great, because it's very easy to get into and everything's kind of on the front, so you can just see it and feel it immediately. I think it's why it's one of his most famous stories.
Yeah, he's very kind of casual about how he's telling the story of how he murdered somebody. Um, and one of the things that I think also repeats in some of his stories, like, there's no, I mean, of course there is suspense, but the suspense is not in the moment necessarily in which he kills the person, or in which a murder is being committed, because we're going to talk about the other story as well, which for some reason I keep forgetting the full name of it. Like, I feel like I'm messing up the name of it every time, but we're going to talk about the second story in a minute. And I feel like every time that there is this moment to narrate the murder or this like insidious action, everything is just like very matter of fact, in the way that the narrator is presenting it. And there's also something that, I mean, every writer is going to have patterns, and every writer is going to have interests that they are exploring in their work. And I think one of the things that kind of where of interest for Edgar Allan Poe was this idea of madness. You know, what does a mad person do? What is madness, and what makes me mad? And so in this particular case of this story, the narrator is trying to present himself as, just a composed person who is just, well, I mean, I am just a normal person, but I happen to have killed someone, which is like, um okay. um but I guess through the narration of the story is through which this unreliable narrator is trying to convince us that they are actually not mad. And it I think about the black cat a little bit, about the narrator for the black cat, when I think about this narrator, because I feel like the black cat, the narrator does something similar, and I think in the end, the end is kind of similar. This there's this character who just did something horrible and is just talking about it so casually, um, and in the end, because of their own obsessions, and because of their own guilt, I want to say, well, I don't know if there's guilt here, but because of their own
I think
kind
it's
of
like paranoia.
paranoia. I think it's more paranoia more than guilt. Because of their own paranoia, they end up turning themselves in without really wanting to turn themselves in. So I think it's something that, for some reason, Edgar Allan Poe, uh, I don't know exactly what to make of that pattern that he had.
I think it reminds me of like true crime. Um, I used to listen to a lot of it, and my favorite ones are ones where they bring in the police interrogations, where they've caught the guy, they know they've caught the guy, but they're trying to get him to slip up and like confess on their own. And a lot of times you see that they're like, they think they're smarter. They think they have, they've won up to you, and they're kind of like they're sitting in that moment, but they always slip up. And sometimes it's because they are nervous at some point. They're like, maybe you do know. Maybe you're messing with me. And usually the cops are. The cops are just trying to get him to like slip up. And I think like there's a couple things as like why this reminds me of it. And it's not just like the kind of lack of empathy and weird like flippancy that the narrator in this story and people who've committed heinous crimes will have to that, but also like our obsession with understanding why. Because I think like Poe writes about these, and it seems like he's making a puzzle and trying to figure it out. Like he's got a Rubik's cube and he's twisting the colors around, trying to understand why somebody would do that, why they feel this way. And I think like true crime is similar, where the audience is listening. They're like, why would you do that? Why would you commit such a horrible crime? Why do you not seem to care when you've done it? I think it's something that like nobody has ever really figured out. I think we sit on it a lot. And the other one is like it reminds me a lot of, I think it's called The Stranger by Albert Camus, where in the story it's like it's very slow, there's not a lot of suspense, you're being narrated, and there's things that slip out from how the narrator is telling you the story that kind of throw out red flags. They just like a lack of empathy, this weird like distance from other people, and a lack of understanding is like to how you would perceive it. And then at the end, when the actual crime is committed, it moves so fast you can almost miss it and not understand it. And both of those stories, I feel like, have that, where there's a horrible murder that happens, but that part's like kind of glossed over. Like they tell it, but the actual taking of the life is like maybe a couple sentences, not even. Like it doesn't even really matter in the whole story. It's not the part that's focused. And if I was like being the narrated story, I feel like that'd be the biggest part if I was telling it, because that's the most horrifying to me. My mind would be stuck on that the most. So it's really weird when the narrator telling you the story is like doesn't even, that's not even the part that matters. So like the build up, the planning, and then the getting caught, but that part doesn't matter. And I think that's part of what makes the story so interesting and engaging.
Yeah, you know what? You mentioned a lot of things that I could just like pull the thread on, but I think one of the ones that I am going to mention is the true crime obsession that we have currently. I am a big fan of true crime. And sometimes when I'm listening to true crime, I forget that it's real. And I'm like, this is like what I have read from in fiction, and I think it's also interesting how this is old, right? This is not something that a contemporary writer wrote, yet Edgar Allan Poe is so big, and his stories keep getting read with even with the fact that you gotta have a certain level of reading skills. You gotta have time. You gotta have a certain attention span, but it's still getting read, and I think it's important how this type of story and also true crime and all of horror movies, anything that has to do with that, it appeals to like this side of our humanity. I think like the morbid side, right? And it's interesting also how you mentioned, many times when you look at the uh or when you look at the stories of how people were killed, sometimes the narrators don't get their audiences by telling them exactly how they were murdered. In fact, sometimes audiences do not even want to know graphic details. They're more interested in how the murder was planned, what is the backstory, what took this person to make this decision, like, and then what happened afterwards, and then people follow the trials and all of that. So the actual big event, which is the murder, didn't even take that long, and it wasn't such a um huge event, right? But everything else is what has our attention, and I think it's because we do really want to understand something that maybe it's not meant for us to be understood. Because in the end, I think that Poe doesn't really understand anything either. So I mean, that's very interesting to think about. Okay, we should kind of give a close to this because we do have another story. I told you time was gonna go by fast. So do you have anything that you would like to say about the story that you would like to close, like any closing thoughts about it? What do you make in the end? Because I know that this is a story that you really like, and I'm glad that um we could have you read a story that you connect with so much. So what would be something that you would leave with after reading it again?
If there's any Edgar Allan Poe, like if you've never read any of his works, Telltale Heart is one that you should read. Like if there's any of them to read, this is going to be both like the easiest to get into, the shortest, you have the least amount of time you have to dedicate to it, and also I think it gives you a really good view of his work while still feeling like it was written today. Even like you could read that and see like, oh, I found this on like a Tumblr post, some guy just like wrote a short story, a creative writing journal, like you could feel like this was written today. I feel like it's the best one to get into. And I also think it opens like a venue of thought, like to just sit there and think about it and be like, why maybe do I not like this? Why do I like this? I think it's fun for people to engage in like the weird, the macabre, the creep, or whatever. And this is a really good way to do it without having it linger so long that you're like freaked out about it. So I would just say like if you haven't read any or you haven't read any recently, just to peruse the Telltale Heart. It's really short. There's not going to be a lot of time commitment, but I think it's a good one to do for sure.
I like that you mentioned that because I mean, I haven't really talked about this yet, but really this video series is about bringing literature closer to people who may not really feel like it's their cup of tea, and it's also about showing you how there's something for everybody in literature. So you probably don't want to read all of Edgar Allan Poe's works because it's impossible. Well, it's not impossible, but it would take you a really big commitment. But I do think it's important to have uh, a practical use or a practical approach to literature and how we consume literature, and it's important to consume it. So I think that's a great advice. Okay, so let's move on to the murders in the Rue Morgue. Did I say that right?
Yes.
The murders in the Rue Morgue. Okay, let's do the same thing. Can you tell us what this is about? And
So the Murders in the Rue Morgue is like a classic kind of who done it. So you have your Sherlock and Watson, basically, though this story does predate that, but you have your Sherlock and your Watson. Dupin is your Sherlock, and I don't remember the name of the other guy, but
I
he's
don't
the
even know if he
narrator.
mentioned it. Does he
Yeah,
mention
I
the
don't
name?
know if his name is ever present, but he is our narrator, and he's telling us about Dupin, our detective. And they, instantly click. They're like besties for a while. They're in Paris, and while they're there, a murder happens, and a mother and her daughter are killed pretty horrifically, and nobody can figure out why. There seems to be no way that the murderer could have escaped. Um, they just can't figure it out. But Dupin, he's figured it out, and so we get the classic like, here are all the facts. They outline the murder. They have all the witnesses in the newspaper, and Dupin's reading it, and your narrator's like, I don't know what happened. Like, there's no way I could get this. And so Dupin narrates how he thinks it happens, and eventually, like, he even meets one of the people who was at the crime scene and basically confirms exactly how he thought it goes down. And basically, what happened is that a sailor had an orangutan. The orangutan escaped and ended up killing the mom and the daughter. And that's how some of the things line up in the case, is because the orangutan possesses the strength to have escaped in a way that no human could, and that's why the police couldn't figure it out, because they were like, these are things that people can't do, and they couldn't think outside of the box. And basically Dupin's like, I can think outside of the box. I figured this out because I possess like supreme intellect or whatever. Like, that's basically how it goes. And he's explaining it to us and the narrator because, we're like stupider than he is, and he's lining it out. And that's basically how it goes. And yeah, this book is it predates, I think, Sherlock by like 40 years. Like, it's one of the first kind of detective murder mysteries. And I think it's pretty fun. I haven't read Sherlock recently, but I do think it's a little bit more condescending than Sherlock. Um but it's very fun, and I think it's a little bit less horrifying and dense than some of Poe's other works, because it is very much like you're just getting the facts of something that happened, and there are things that seem weird, but you wouldn't be able to figure it out. But then once it is outlined to you, you're like, oh, it's so obvious in retrospect. So it's a pretty fun read, but it is a lot longer than The Telltale Heart. Like, it's a pretty decent chunk of words to read.
Yes, and it's also Edgar Allan Poe on his most polished use of language. This is not a story that you want to read as an amateur or even as somebody who teaches English for a living. Like, I'm gonna tell you that this was challenging for me. And I was telling you earlier how I read all of these stories when I was a teenager, and I read them in Spanish. Um, and and I remember them being difficult. But one of the things is that something that Edgar Allan Poe has is that once you start, you kind of want to figure it out, you know? So, like, even if it's difficult, you just want to keep going. And I remember when I started reading this time, because I read him many years ago. I was a teenager. Um, I mean, it's not that many years ago, but now I feel like I never read these stories, so to me it was almost like the first time, and it's also the first time I read them in English. So it's a completely different experience. And I remember that the first pages of this story, everything is so, it's like he's talking about the difference between analyzing and observing, I think it is, and he gets into this like, and it's the narrator. The narrator gets into this kind of like explanation, very intellectual explanation, and then he gets into how he met Dupin.
And he loves Dupin. Every time Dupin talks, he's like, oh my goodness, he's so smart. It's like when you read The Great Gatsby, and the whole time he's just like, oh, Gatsby's amazing. It's that same level of love for Dupont that you get from the narrator the whole time. He's just like, how did he know this? Nobody could ever think of this. He's a total genius, unlike anyone I've ever met before. And it's the whole story, the whole time.
You know what? I didn't think of that, but it's true. And one of the things that I did notice is that Dupin talks and talks and talks and talks and talks. And I was like, I know this is fiction, but that is not how dialogue works, you know? So it was like these monologues that he had, especially when he's explaining how everything happened, or how he thinks that everything happened. At some point I had to remind myself, I'm like, wait, this is Dupin saying what he thinks happened. We don't know that this is true, you know? And then at the end, I guess it turns out it was true because the police acknowledged that, oh yeah, this is how we solved the case. And I'm like, I think these policemen are very lazy because like they didn't do much investigation and they were willing to go with the first theory that they had. And then now DuPont comes here and oh yeah, it all makes sense. So I don't know how. I think this is one of those stories where I do have a hard time believing the fiction. I mean,
the like the
yeah,
way he's like, oh, this is totally what happened. You're like,
yeah, you know, like,
it's kind
yeah,
of extravagant. Actually, I don't think so.
and when I say I have a hard time believing the fiction, yes, I know all of this is fiction, but I had a somebody once told me you have to you or every time that you read a fictional story you suspend disbelief, meaning that you believe that what you are reading is true, right? And that's something that you definitely have to do for Edgar Allan Poe. And for example, in The Telltale Heart, that happens very easily. You believe what's happening. But here I think I have a harder time, and not even believing the murders. I totally believe the murders, but I think it's this interaction between these two characters is that it's very hard for me to believe that it's realistic. And I know this is not reality, but still within within its fictional universe, we want to believe these things. And to me, it's just, of course, this would only happen if a person kind of makes another person kind of puts them on a pedestal, right? And I think that's very interesting. I didn't really think about that.
I think it's easier for like a modern day example. There's two movies, Knives Out and Glass Onion, that do similar storylines but with like a comedic twist,
Mhm.
and they do a really good job. And it's just a fact of the medium of showing these like dialogues where they're like saying what they think would happen, and it's so out there. But in the movies, you get the flashbacks to those scenes where they're visualizing, they're laying out what they think happened, and I think that makes it easier to immerse yourself. And I think when you're reading the story and it's just like, this is all conjecture and he's just talking at me, and that's a lot harder to imagine it and see it happening. So I think this is one that the genre that he kind of started has built on itself and has had new takes that I think are easier for an audience to engage with. I don't remember what the detective's name is in those movies, but
Yeah.
they're a pretty good lighthearted version of this, I feel. And if this was comedic, it's definitely been lost to time. I also doubt Poe was writing this for comedy. This is not his forte.
Yeah. But you know what? I think it's interesting because I have actually thought about this. Yeah, I mean, we have such an offer now of this genre, of the or whatever genre you want. I don't know anything about genres, but whether you like true crime or whether you like horror or anything like that, we have such an offer. And seeing the killing of because there's a very graphic description of their bodies.
Yeah, heads fall off.
Heads fall off and all of that. But if you are somebody who is a fan of horror and all of that, you have probably seen way worse depictions of murders and you know in movies. So this kind of thing doesn't. I mean, reading Edgar Allan Poe is probably not going to have such a. It's not going to freak you out as much. It's pretty much what we talked about earlier. The build up and all of that is what freaks you out a little more. But also, if you think about it, if you think about when this came out and all of that, this is I mean, he was a pioneer, right? So he started it, or he was one of the people who started it. And so at the time, this story must have been so um unsettling for people.
Or like dumbfounding. It's like when The Matrix came out and it was like the greatest ever, but then every movie in that genre since has tried to kind of replicate that story and that feeling. And so then if you've never seen The Matrix and you go back to watch The Matrix, it's not that amazing because you've seen the amazing thing it made replayed, and so you're like, this isn't that crazy. But if you were there, like if you were there when it came out, which I wasn't, but if you were there when it
I
came
was.
out, you're like, oh, this is crazy. This is a whole new thing. And I think that's part of it. Like if I was, back in the day reading this printed in a newspaper or something, I would be like,
What?
I never would have thought that that's how, like, I could not predict that. And
Uh-huh.
the other thing with this story is I think it is kind of crazy. Like in other whodunits, you can potentially puzzle it out yourself. You can kind of like Agatha Christie's. Hers are so well done that sometimes you can, like if you're just really good at paying attention, you can figure out who the killer is before you get to the end. I don't think I ever could have figured this one out. Like I think this puzzle is a little bit too out there because there's just like I never would have predicted that the killer is an orangutan.
Yeah.
Like he pulls that out of left field. I'm like, what do you mean?
It is
Like the
crazy.
hairs are not like people's hairs. How was I supposed to know that this clump of gray hair you find on the scene is an ant? I could not have figured that out. So a little bit, I do think that one of the things that makes it hard to immerse in the story is the fact that I can't puzzle it out. Like I can sit there and feel like I'm collecting evidence and I know something's wrong, but I'm definitely like the narrator where I'm like, I have no clue. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good take. I mean, it's a great story because Edgar Allan Poe is amazing. But it has its challenges, right? Um I was gonna say something. Oh, just as a side note, I was already here when, or like I already went through, or how am I gonna say this, or how do I want to say this? I went through the Matrix being released,
Mm-hmm.
and it was amazing. It was like everybody was like, "Oh my god, did you see the Matrix? Did you already see it? Oh my god, it's wild!" Yeah, I remember that. I remember that. So that tells a little bit about my age, but it's fine. It was amazing. It was an amazing experience. Okay, so I think we can close this. Do you have anything that you would like to close this with, or have we said enough about it?
I think we've said enough. I had passages outlined, but I'm gonna be honest, they're really long. So it doesn't matter.
It's up to you. We have 5 minutes. I just have a.
No, no, it's okay. I think it would take me more than 5 minutes to read them all.
Okay,
It
okay, great.
extends further.
Okay, all right. And then just to basically close the session, I just want to ask you. Let me see. Hmm, I have three questions. I think they may turn into more, but the first question is, so this is completely something that our guests are doing for free with their time. They are deciding to read the stories and to come into the studio and talk about these stories. So we are very grateful to you and to all of our guests. And so the question I want to ask you is, I asked you to be one of our guests, and you said yes, despite the time commitment and the effort commitment. And I want to know, why did you decide to say yes?
Well, a couple of things. I was mostly looking for something to engage in. I have been in El Paso like 2 years now. I don't speak Spanish, and the first 7 months, I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have anything to do. It was pretty horrible. And the only thing that helped me get to know people is I put myself out there and I went to a crochet group at a library. So all the friends that I had and still have, they were all in their like 70s to 80s, which they're very lovely ladies and I love them, but I want to like get some of my age group peers, so I decided I needed to put myself out there and engage in my community things. And since I started school, I was like, okay, I'll check out what they have available. Granted, when I asked you about this, I thought it was gonna be a book club, but I was still down. I was like, this is still a good thing to do. And also one of my goals in January was to just like read every evening. So it was already gonna fit in and help me like continue my goal. And I was just hoping to get experience. I don't have a lot of money. I'm in my 20s. This is the time to be young and broke. But I want to have experiences and like knowledge and build myself out a little bit. So this was a way of doing that, I guess. So, yeah.
Okay, that's great. Um, I didn't know that about you, but I can tell you that I do speak Spanish, and when I moved to El Paso, I was 6 months, more or less like 6 months, no friends. I didn't have any friends. It's it's hard moving. I feel it's hard moving, and I moved from Juarez, so I can't imagine what it is to move from farther away. Yeah, so it's tough. But I think these things work, and we have more things coming up, so stay tuned. And then the other question was why these stories, I mean, the Telltale Heart and the Murders in the Rue Morgue. You kind of answered already the Telltale Heart, but why the Murders in the Rue Morgue? Why did you choose those?
I've read it before, and it has kind of felt to me like a little bit out of the blue for what Poe writes, or at least what I associate with him. Because I associate, the Telltale Heart, a lot of his poetry that's like sad, macabre, weird, and you kind of can't get into it. Um, and so I've always thought that the little sections that he's done that are just, the detective stories, where they're not as scary. They're definitely just little puzzles of figuring it out. Mm-hmm. And I always felt they stand out to me as not fitting in with the rest of his writing, but they are just as engaging to me. So I wanted to like include one of them so you can see like the range that he can write in. Because for some people they don't want to read the Telltale Heart. They don't care about that. But they might be into, the Murders in the Rue Morgue. They might like Sherlock-esque stories. Or vice versa. They don't care about figuring out who did it. They think those are stupid, but maybe they're more into the things that like kind of grip them and feel suspenseful. So I was like, it's a good range to have somebody see and be interested in. And I personally always think it's fun to see things that are the beginning of something. I love to see what started something. Mm-hmm. And this is the start of an entire genre. So that's always like really cool to like see and see how it changes. That's just something I like observing, at least.
Yeah, I was very happy that I chose this, despite the fact that I was like, oh my god, I have to look up so many words. But I was very happy to reread them and to read them this time in English. It was fascinating. And then the last question that I have for you is, why do you think somebody who is not, going to school, or somebody who is not going to school for anything related to literature or with an English major or anything like that, why do you think they should read Edgar Allan Poe, particularly the stories that you mentioned, or maybe Edgar Allan Poe in general, whichever one you want to answer?
I think there's a lot of reasons. For like reading in general, no matter what career, degree, whatever you're pursuing, communication is incredibly, incredibly important. And I myself am very lacking in pop culture knowledge. I don't know a lot of stuff, and I do find myself not being able to like meet people where they're at sometimes because I don't understand like references they use or stuff. But reading classics and things like that can kind of help you understand parts of like culture that aren't as obvious. Like there are some phrases that we've taken from books that were written like 200 years ago that now nobody knows where they're from, but you can get a context and understanding. And I also just think like it does help with your ability to communicate with people. It gets you thinking, and I think that pushing yourself out of those boundaries will just make you better at any job you're doing. And then for Edgar Allan Poe in specific, this is biased. I love horror. I love the weird stuff. I've always loved it. And if you like horror, this is like it is a classic. You can't get away from it. You can read it and you'll make connections to other horrors you read, other things you consume. I know we didn't hit it, but The Pit and the Pendulum reminds me a lot of the first Saw movie. It's very much they're both of your little protagonists are trapped in a small room with pre-made horrors where they're gonna die either way. It's just how horrific do they want to die. The difference is The Pit and the Pendulum ends nicer. There's like a kind of happy ending, or at least ambiguous ending. Saw not the same.
Oh god.
but like things like that where it's like I like making those connections. I like being able to see that, and I think it gives you a venue of like broadening your experience and the things you get to do. So I would just say read anything, basically.
Okay, all right, great answer. And also, it's fun. Reading can be fun. I know that for some reason people, well, not for some reason, but reading can be challenging, and so for some people it is challenging, but give it a chance, and a real committed chance, and you will see that you will find something you like. All right, so this is it for today. Thank you so much, Mikaela. I really appreciate you being here.
Of course, thanks for having me on.
And if you guys liked this episode, and if you are liking this series, please go ahead and like and subscribe. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.